Welcome. I'm Professor Nick Hardaker, Dean of the School of Human and Health Sciences at the University of Huddersfield and Professor of Nursing and Health Informatics, and I'll be today's chair for today's webinar. As Dean, but also as a nursing researcher myself, I'm really proud to be welcoming you to this webinar. The University of Huddersfield has been commissioned by NHS England to host and deliver a series of webinars to showcase and celebrate the importance of nursing-led research. Previous webinars have covered a range of topics, including COVID-19, end-of-life and palliative care, and mental health. After each webinar, we ask attendees what research topics they'd like to hear more about in future webinars. And a key response was to hear about research-related initiatives undertaken by nursing community that supports inclusivity and diversity in research, the focus of today's webinar. Today, we're joined by three excellent speakers who are leading names in their field. They'll be presenting their research and discussing their experiences of conducting research on today's topic. Carl Adam is Deputy Lead at the Leonard Wolfson Experimental Neurology Centre, University College London Hospital's NHS Foundation Trust. Carl will be discussing initiatives to facilitate research recruitment in underrepresented communities. Dr. Roseanne Crosby-Nwobi is lead nurse for research at Moorfields Eye Hospital and honorary associate professor at UCL's Institute of Ophthalmology. Roxanne will be speaking about the role of faith, place, and health in addressing health inequalities. Professor Vanessa Heaslip is Professor of Nursing and Healthcare Equity at the University of Salford. Vanessa's presentation is entitled Engaging with Hidden Voices. We won't be breaking between speakers, but we'll be bringing them all back together after the talks to discuss issues raised by their research. Please pose questions or make comments using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Before we hear from our speakers, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Mark Radford, Deputy Chief Nursing Officer for NHS England and Chief Nurse and Deputy CEO for Health Education England, who'd like to make a few opening remarks. Mark.
Nick, thank you. And thanks, colleagues, for a really warm welcome here at Huddersfield University. I'd just like to say thanks to the team who have put forward and developed these seminars. There's a huge amount of logistical work that goes into developing these and also the tech and IT support. So thanks to the team for doing that. It has been really popular, these series, and this one in particular, we've had over 500 people want to join this. It's such an important topic. Nick's kind of framed this. We've got three excellent speakers a little bit later on to talk through some really important areas in relation to diversity and inclusion within research. This, for me, I think is a really fundamental topic, not just within nursing research, but across the spectrum of research opportunities that we need to consider in relation to public benefit and need. Our patients across the UK fundamentally get better outcomes as a result of the research that we undertake. Focusing in on those communities and also understanding representation and inclusivity is really, really important. I think there are three main things for me to kind of focus on in kind of my opening remarks, and they will go into much more detail with the expert speakers that we have a bit later and the panel discussion. Firstly is the issue around diversity of research itself. At public policy level, we fundamentally have to get better ensuring that we design and deliver programs of research that really reach through to the heart of understanding different aspects of diversity of the population that we serve, both in terms of health and social care, but also in terms of understanding disease, as well as also both physical health and mental health issues, to ensure that we're able to deliver better outcomes for individuals as well as also communities. I think there's much that I've seen shift over the last 15 or 20 years in relation to public participation and involvement in research. It's now such a key part of what we do in terms of its design. And many of the programs I work on have patient and public involvement and much richer in terms of the outcomes that we want to achieve as a result of really, really thought through approaches involving inclusivity. Now, I think there's some real important aspects of challenge in here, though, of course, because we don't get this right. And I know that many will talk about actively reaching out into different communities to understand the impact of understanding disease profiles, as well as also care approaches that we have both in physical and mental health. but also importantly in terms of how we would approach research design and research questions itself. It is really sometimes common when I look through the literature to find that lots of aspects around inclusivity and diversity, when we're starting to look at populations, is often done by those from diverse backgrounds. And less from others. And I think it's a really important question that we focus on when we start to think about research careers and opportunities and the diversity that we expect to see within the research community itself, as well as also importantly, the wider emphasis that we should have on diversity when we're starting to think about research questions itself. Now, fundamentally about the research is about the public need. And there are many aspects and previous discussions we've had on webinars. We've explored issues around health inequalities associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, around vaccine uptake as examples. But there is much more work to do, I think, in terms of understanding some of the the injustices that exist around access to healthcare here in England and the United Kingdom, but more globally. And also further research to understand how improvements in access, particularly to those communities that aren't necessarily represented within the research profile, I think is really important. So a good example of this was a study in the US, a phase 2 trial looking at crenezumab, which is an Alzheimer's drug. When actually looking at the data as an example, the FDA identified that actually over 83 sites in 6 countries, 97.5% of all of the research participants were white. 2.8% was Hispanic. And the challenge here, of course, is actually Black and Hispanic colleagues fundamentally have a much higher rate of Alzheimer's. So there is real tangible issues in relation to research design, research questions, research participation and involvement, and the types of approach we have in relation to supporting improved outcomes through research, and notably in this example, looking at a pharmacological approach. But we can apply that to lots of nursing, whether it's randomized controlled trials or other types of research activity, where inclusivity is really important. My final point is really about the research community. Now, this is a global problem. When we start to think about approaches in relation to diversity of really diverse communities that we have here within England. But as an example, in New Zealand, 17% of the population are Maori, but actually only 5% of the academic community come from a Maori background. And actually, if we start to look at senior positions, it becomes less than 1%. Similar in the US, where we see around 1.2% of the population being Native American. Actually, when we look at some of the 50 top schools ranging from mathematics right through to engineering, sociology, and a range of other disciplines, we find no representation at all from Native Americans working in those fields. So it's a global issue, but one fundamentally that we absolutely have to drive improvements here in the United Kingdom. And one of the things is around issues around gender imbalance as well as ethnicity within the research community. If we think about the number of people from Black and minority backgrounds and for protected characteristics that join the nursing profession, they are vastly underrepresented in senior positions, both within academia and leadership and research. So there's much we need to do really in understanding not only what we research, how we research it as well, how we involve those from different communities in the design and delivery of research, but also fundamentally putting a mirror back onto ourselves as nurses to think about how we are preparing and delivering active researchers from a much more diverse background. And one of the aspects of the CNO research strategy that was launched recently in the plan is fundamentally looking at both research active communities, but also improving opportunities and outcomes from those from a Black or minority background or protected characteristics is really important. So there's much we've got to really understand across a range of different questions in this. And I'm really delighted that the seminar today has been able to really bring together some fantastic speakers to really explore these in detail. And I can't wait to get into the questions a little bit later on. So thank you very much, everybody. I look forward to the discussion. Nick, back to you.
So let's move on to the reason that we're all here and dive in. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Carl Adam. And I'll see you all in a little while. Over to you, Carl.
Thank you, Nick. Good morning, everyone. Let me just share you my screen. Okay, thank you, everyone, to all the people behind this webinar for inviting me. My presentation is based on the initiatives that I have implemented during my time in King's College till last month, together with my colleagues from the renal rehab research, in order to bolster our recruitment from underrepresented group in one of our clinical trials. I also added a research study at the end of this slide, which was the byproduct of this strategy. Before I proceed, let me just give you some background why recruitment from underrepresented communities is very important. We often hear health inequality, which is a disparity amongst different population groups in accessing health services. But the same principle is also happening in research. There is a health research inequality where there is also disparity in accessing important research, especially from underrepresented communities, which potentially they are missing out on the opportunity to get valid treatment options. And their lack of participation may reduce the generalizability of any research findings. So why research or diversity in research is important? Because it should reflect the diverse population. And diverse representation helps researchers and clinicians as well to better understand the prevalence of diseases on people from different backgrounds and how it affects them. And enrolling diverse people will ensure that treatments are safe and effective for different population groups. And that is what I meant by the generalizability. That is why diversity in clinical trials benefits everyone. Now let's look at the race and ethnicity distribution in clinical trials. This is how the representation of diversity from general population looks like versus diversity in clinical trials. Not very good. This is supported by the data from the FDA, where globally 3/4 of the participants in clinical trials are white, while the remainders are from the rest of the racial groups. That is one massive difference. In the UK, there's a study by Smart and Harrison in 2017 that showed only 5% of respondents from ethnic minorities have ever participated in clinical trials. And more recently, for COVID-19 vaccine trials, out of almost 300,000 participants, only 7% were from ethnic minorities. This only showed that a lot of work needs to be done in order to bridge this gap. Now, what about the participation of underrepresented group in renal research? This graph shows it's not as bad as the global figures from the previous slides, but it's still not great. With just over 50% are white in participating in renal research, while Black has improved at 25%, but we could still do more. And the remainders are the rest of the racial groups. This data is from the clinicaltrials.gov, more than 500 kidney disease trials registered. This only showed that despite the understanding how important diversity is in health research, the participation of underrepresented group remains subpar. Now let's link this to kidneys. Why participation in renal research is crucial for ethnic minorities? What does the data show? Kidney disease is 5 times more common in BAME communities. The reason being is because 2 main causes of kidney disease, diabetes and high blood pressure. This graph showed the distribution of hypertension and diabetes by ethnicity in the UK, which means South Asians and Africans are 2 to 4 times more likely to become diabetic and hypertensive. Hence, they are more at risk of developing kidney disease. That is why we need to encourage them to participate in clinical research and clinical trials. In this slide, I will give you some background of the ongoing clinical trials that we are part of that has become the impetus for us to develop initiatives to improve our recruitment. This is a trial called Vertex 801. It is a commercial study sponsored by a pharmaceutical company from the United States. It is a genotype study where we take blood samples and saliva samples, looking at the prevalence of these APOL1 alleles on individuals with proteinuria. We are looking to recruit patients with kidney disease caused by FSGS or focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, where the target population are people from African ancestry and geographic origin for people who identify as Black, Caribbean, African American, or Latinx. So for those of you who are not in renal, FSGS is considered as one of the rare kidney diseases. So imagine recruiting participants from rare disease and from group of people who are less likely to participate. We knew that this was going to be very challenging. So we set our recruitment target to just 5. We were just being realistic to avoid embarrassment. So aside from the information from the previous slides, we also took into consideration the potential barriers that really pushed us in developing initiative to overcome the identified challenges. These are the reported barriers from the direct observation of the research team, as well as from the responses of patients who refused to participate. And we have come up with 5 common themes. The lack of access to information, mainly because of the internet access or lack of materials in multiple languages. Mistrust, there's a lot of misinformation over the internet, and fear of harm. Maybe they watch something in the television that says about side effects when you participate in clinical trials. Cultural beliefs, the misconception and disapproval from the family. Inconvenience with the strict criteria, limited transportation, and inflexible visits, or even use of technology, because there are patients who may not be that technologically literate. And COVID-19 for obvious reason, because of the lockdown, the fear of becoming ill, and lack of transportation. So looking at these barriers, and based on those information, we utilize the PPI from our research department and the patient's representative in renal research. Together, they formed and co-hosted a focus group, which became the fuel for innovation, where they explore barriers, drivers, perceptions, and attitudes. And based on those information, they were able to understand behaviors and make decisions to make recommendations to improve our recruitment strategies. In these slides, you will see the initiatives and strategies that we have implemented based on the recommendation of the focus groups. The first one is the flexibility. Remember, these patients are volunteers, so we have to accommodate them. So especially for those who are in working population. So sometimes they would like to do it before they go to work. So we have to come in early, or after their work. So we have to stay late. So we have to be flexible enough for them. Coincide, which means coinciding the research visit with clinical appointment. This is to minimize their hospital visits. No one wants to keep on coming to hospital so often. The next is collaborate. This is collaborating with clinical staff to combine research and clinic procedures. This is also to minimize patients' inconvenience. For example, if patients will have clinic bloods and also they will have research bloods. So instead of them having to be needled twice, so we can do it at the same time. So that is minimizing patients' inconvenience. And that will also save time of both patients and clinical colleagues. Educate, we use some ethically approved posters in the criminal area, and the study was presented in the academic meeting just to ensure that patients or our colleagues are aware. And we also put inclusion-exclusion cards in clinic room so they can make direct referral of patients who they think would benefit when they participate in the trial. Next is contact. This is to ensure that patients would not feel that they're just part of the numbers or that they're just guinea pig. This is for us to establish rapport so that we could approach them for future research studies as well. Support. This is where the patient's representative comes into play, because we offer peer educator input to facilitate culturally congruous support. So patients are more likely to be convinced to participate if they can see people who look like them, who they can identify with, especially if they had experience in participating in trials. Next is bespoke. PI can offer bespoke consultation, and they can also make direct referral for patients participating in our trial to other clinical colleagues. For example, if patient requires dietitian referral, physios, or medics because they had issue with bladder aside from their kidneys, so they can refer these patients directly to urologists. So those are the advantages of patients participating in the trial, so they can have that bespoke appointment. And lastly is the incentives, so that it would not be so much of inconvenience for the patient and they would not be out of pockets, especially for trials that are very demanding where there's so many procedures involved. Sometimes we, during our costing, we cost the patients inconvenience so that they feel like they are not just being used for the trial, so their inconvenience is compensated. So obviously this amount is ethically approved so that it will not look like that they are being bribed to participate. In this slide, I will show you the outcome of the implementation of these strategies, which have been very successful. We had 90% recruitment rate, with only 10% of those who were approached did not consent. Previously, I mentioned to you that our recruitment target was 5. We have actually exceeded the target to 75, which is a 1,400% increase. Doctors' referral has increased by 4-fold within 5 months of implementation. We were able to offer patients who were eligible to participate in phase 2 and phase 3 trials. You may not know that currently there is no treatment specific for FSGS, and this trial is an opportunity for them to access that as a potential treatment option. And I was also able to present my abstract relating to this initiative to an international audience last year, or conference last year. And another outcome, the team was put on the spotlight in a good way. We were featured in newsletters in few occasions and promotional videos. Promotional video is not available yet. They're still in the finalization of the video, but they interviewed clinical colleagues and also patients who completed trials regarding their experience in participating. And we are one of the top recruiters and the only site outside the United States to do so. And these are the examples of the newsletter. And finally, we were the first site to be featured in the Site Insight, where we shared our success story in terms of patient recruitment initiatives for the underrepresented group. And I mentioned at the beginning that as a byproduct of these initiatives, we also use these initiatives for other research projects. This one is a study called Apple CKD. We're also looking for, it is a genotype study exploring genetics and environmental factors associated with chronic kidney disease. It's a non-commercial study. We're also recruiting for the same population group, but with the addition of healthy volunteers. So aside from the strategies that I've mentioned earlier, we have added additional strategies in order to increase our recruitment, because the number has increased with the healthy volunteers to match the CKD population. So we utilize the use of social media. So within a few days of tweet, there are almost 400 interests registered. Obviously, we filter this based on the eligibility criteria. And then patient representatives are active involved with the recruitment. They're just more than just reviewing documents. This representative was given a smartphone so that prospective participants can contact her if they have questions. And as for the healthy volunteers, we have renal nurse representative who encourage clinical colleagues to participate as healthy volunteers. And there's also a student representative within the university to encourage students and to raise awareness about volunteering. And more recently, we had this research recruitment stand at the atrium, which was proven to be a success. Here you will see my lovely colleagues, the renal nurse and the patient representative during the recruitment drive so that we can capture healthy volunteers. This could be visitors or patients who do not have kidney disease, but may be eligible to participate as healthy volunteers. And this was well received, and this picture was actually their second event, and they're planning to do more of this in the future. So to conclude, co-development matters. The key to successful recruitment is by taking proactive approach with co-development from community members to enhance recruitment from underrepresented group. Recruitment potentials can be maximized by carefully planned recruitment strategies to meet the demands of research studies and also the needs of the participants. And finally, formal evaluation of these strategies is needed. Thank you very much for listening, and I will now stop sharing my slide and hand you back to Nick. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carl. Really useful information there. Very and amazing results actually from your work. I'm sure we'll return to some of the issues that you talked about later in the discussion session. So please, audience members, please do pose questions in the Q&A box there, and we'll try to return to those at the discussion at the end. So I'll hand over right away now to Roxanne, who's going to deliver our second presentation. Over to you, Roxanne. You're just muted.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Perfect.
I'll just share my screen. Great. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Roxanne Crosby-Nairobi. I'm a postdoctoral nurse researcher at the Moorfields Eye Hospital. And thank you to Professor Jo Cooper and her team for inviting me to contribute to this session. So just a couple of things I'd like you to think about throughout the session and be able to recognize at the end of the session the role of health in tackling health inequalities, and also be able to discuss the role of faith in the research process. So this theoretical model from Cooper 2022 shows the 4 facets of a person. As a nurse, we know that this model has been with us since the activities of daily living from the beginning of our training, but it's just to bring home to reality that a person actually has these 4 facets, and we should always look and take care of a patient in this holistic manner, be it at the bedside or during the research process. Now, for some people, the spiritual facets heavily influences the other 3 facets. And as a nurse and a person of faith, I found it difficult at times to navigate my faith and my profession for fear of being reported or misunderstood. A key example, I remember as a young nurse working with a patient who was away from home for a university placement, had been admitted overnight. Her parents weren't able to make it there with her. And I can't remember how the discussion came about that I'm a Christian, but she asked me to pray with her because she was in need of that support. And I remember literally almost climbing under the bed covers with her and whispering this word of prayer in her ear, just so that it wouldn't be misconstrued by the other members of staff or the other patients within that bay. So we need to, you know, the NMC gives us a code of conduct and standards, but it can be times that is quite difficult as a person to navigate that. So I'm just going to talk about 3 areas and 3 projects where we were able to use the role of faith in research to tackle health inequalities. So the first example looks at our research clinics and our eye clinics at Moorfields, and we noted that there's a high DNA rate among our minority ethnic populations. So within my Florence Nightingale project, and my claim to fame is meeting a Dame Ruth May at that event, we spoke to several focus groups of individuals from different communities. We brought together different eye charities as well. And this is what our patients and our charities told us, that there seemed to be a decreased awareness of eye conditions in the population. Similar to what Carl just presented, you know, there are socioeconomic restrictions, language barriers, societal stigma, mistrust, and most importantly for us and this talk is the religious and cultural beliefs. So what did we do about this? We also got the solutions for these problems from our communities. So we went from issues to solutions, and they suggested that we initiate support hospital-based and community-based education programs. We tailor these sessions to our community. So we go where people gather, either the churches, mosques, temples, hairdressers, community centers. We use Zoom. We also use these sessions to dispel myths, and most importantly, we engage with the trusted community leaders. And one example of how this worked really well was that in our eye clinics, we noted that our patients from a Muslim background, after the season of Ramadan, they tended to present with very, very high intraocular pressures, and it was controlled. So we spoke to our groups to ask them what exactly was going on during that period. We then realized that during Ramadan and while fasting, you're not allowed to ingest food. But our patients, after they put the eye drops in, they had an aftertaste of the eye drops at the back of their throat. So therefore, they were not taking the eye drops in order to meet their religious requirements. So we got together with the Muslim Council of Britain to produce education leaflets on punctal occlusion. That's where you occlude the tear duct, and that essentially stops any medication going down the tear duct to the back of the nose to the throat, and then it prevented any aftertaste. And during this sustained campaign, we had lots more patients now taking their medication because they realize they can do something to help themselves biologically through their medication, but also it will still adhere to their spiritual beliefs. Using the learning from that QI project, we also got some funding from the North Thames Clinical Research Network, and we partnered with the Ascension Trust and another charity called Sahara to deliver eye health sessions and promote research in underserved communities. So you have a few examples here, and Carl would recognize his research nurse doing that kidney research in these outreach sessions. We were able to promote research opportunities at Moorfields, give information on glaucoma, and here we've got a trusted faith leader and lots of people engaging. From an eye perspective, we were also able to show people what different eye conditions look like, and then gave them information about eye health and preventative eye measures. With our Sahara group, thank you to them as well for hosting us. And my lovely colleague here, Subhash, in the top right-hand corner, was able to give an entire message on eye health and research in Hindi and at time Gujarati and Punjabi. And it was a very, very enjoyable session. They also helped us design our leaflets. So here we converted our English leaflets into Gujarati, Hindi, and Punjabi. And then during this session, we had a question and answer feedback. And one patient said, for 8 years, I was using eye drops and no one explained or told me how to do it. The team explained it really well. And I'm very forgetful, but these words I will never forget. It was very touching and very emotional. I now know why I can participate in research, why I have to participate in research, and I'll definitely have a look at what research there is to offer. And that was just a culmination for us of that entire piece of work that we're doing. We're actually reaching the patients via research and then via their trusted mediums. For this third project, I was very privileged to work with Dame Sarah Mullally, who is an ally and was driven to examine the role of faith as a leverage to tackle health inequalities. And as you can see, she was also the former Chief Nursing Officer of England. So these two matters are very, very close to her heart. She convened the Health Inequalities Action Group, which comprised of a number of nurse research leaders, so myself and Professor Calvin Morley, as well as leaders from the Anglican, Black majority church, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, and Jewish faith traditions. We used the theological concept of shalom as a public health and policy framework for this project. What does shalom mean? Shalom means wellness or well-being, and to experience shalom is to flourish physically, psychologically, socially, and spiritually. Back again to that 4 facets of a person. We all know that the 2010 Marmot Review exposed the stark reality of health inequalities in our communities. And the COVID pandemic further exacerbated these existing health inequalities. The health sector at that time found that it was critical to use a whole systems approach to navigate this situation. The pandemic highlighted the power of faith institutions to act as mediating institutions between the people and the government, between people and people, to achieve a state of well-being in a time of severe distress. and that concept was shalom. For our data collection, we had 2 town halls. So the first was Intrafaith, hosted by an Anglican church in Hackney, and the second was an interfaith session held at a mosque in Tower Hamlets. The consultation was guided by the following objectives. So we wanted to identify what priority areas they are for improving the health of our local communities. We wanted to understand how our faith organizations could help meet these needs in the local communities. We wanted to explore how we can use these faith organizations within our communities to improve health outcomes, and then also introduce participants to different faith models so we can get them thinking about how, where, with whom they can engage in these action models. And we have a few examples coming up later on. So these are the themes. We had about 5 themes and insights. And the one I'll focus on really is the faith groups as health service providers or advocates. So during the COVID pandemic, we had several groups, and I'll highlight the Muslim population, where in their belief, it's important that the body is, person is buried as soon as possible. And then they were able to take what is a tithing system and use that money to set up mortuaries to allow their relatives and friends to be buried in a manner that is suitable to their faith. When we know across the NHS we had long lists, waiting lists for people to be buried, and there was lots of distress going on, this group was able to pull together via Faith Network to ensure that this service is available for their teams. We had lots of other examples of people having health and well-being groups, seminars, online, socially distanced meetings, people distributing PPE, people also having food hubs and hot kitchens to give people hot meals. So the key points from this: we know that faith institutions can be regarded as a civic institution which represents the diverse communities. Therefore, we should legitimize them to be able to continue their good work in this fashion. And we should put a public value on them so that they can leverage and restore the trust in our contemporary society. Professor Calvin Morley famously said, there's a goodwill tax on people of faith. So therefore, we should equip these faith communities with the fundamentals of public health and health promotion to effect change. Throughout this project, we were able to demonstrate leadership where we were using our knowledge and skills as research leaders to address health inequalities. We were also able to provide research internships with Professor Calvin Morley to 2 of his London South Bank second-year students. And out of that placement, they were then able to learn about the entire research process, do focus group interviews, do analysis, and also report writing. And we are hoping that this report will be able to change policy, because it has since been presented to the Mayor of London for further development, and is due for presentation at the Houses of Parliament. Now, coming on to my last slide, I've put this GIF in here because this is exactly what happened to me during one of my research studies. Very naive PhD student going to speak to a patient in Southeast London about research and taking bloods for diabetic eye disease, and she literally threw her slipper at me. And her accusations were that I was selling out the community, it was against her faith and religion, and this was her initial reaction. However, due to the intersectionality between my faith, me being of an ethnic minority, me being female, me being non-British, I was able to sit with her and explain how the wisdom gained from any research that we do and how her faith will work together. And she was more likely then to participate in research. So the next time I spoke to her at her following visit, she actually did come on to the study because she was then able to explain it to her community, and she got the support from her community to join our research project. Another example from a Muslim patient, he said to us that, if I can, I will see an imam instead of a doctor because they're more likely to get it. And when we dived into, what does it mean? It means a holistic picture. His imam is more able to give him advice from a spiritual perspective to affect his other perspectives. So this is where faith is very, very important. And we should recognize this when we're dealing with our patients. So we can move from this situation to this situation where we have perfect informed consent. So thank you very much for listening. These are my contact details, and we'll take the questions in the panel session. Over to Nick.
Thank you, Roxanne. Absolutely fascinating. Yeah, that the recipient of the slipper clearly had practiced his dodging techniques.
Yeah, that was me.
So thank you so much. I mean, really, looking at the role of faith groups in public health, kind of obvious to some extent, but also looking at health as a catalyst for social cohesion, absolutely amazing. Yeah, so thank you. We'll come back to that with questions towards the end. So thank you very much, and we'll go straight on to our final and third speaker, Vanessa. Please, who's our next speaker? Thank you.
So good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to join. You'll see in my first slide with my title, I have deliberately highlighted in red the word hidden, and that's because I really want to explore and question and challenge that during the process of my participation. And so my first couple of slides I will go through quite quickly, but I think it's really important to set the context of the way in which we're working and why the importance of engaging with different communities within research. And so I really start by looking at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and quite often as nurses we will focus on those that are related to good health and well-being and health inequalities. But I would argue we really need to look at some of these other areas to really understand and appreciate some of the challenges people face around engaging with research, but also the importance of these around the social determinants of health. So a quick example, we talk about clean water and sanitation, and we may make the assumption that everybody has access to that here within the UK. But if we look at people who are living rough on the streets, or we look at Gypsy Roma travellers that are living roadside, actually access to clean water and sanitation is incredibly problematic. The next slide, I just really want to give you a quote that I heard once at a keynote, and that is, there is nothing more unequal than the equal treatment of unequal people. And I think a lot within the NHS we focus on equality, and for me I question this, I challenge this, because I think actually a focus on equality, as we see through the pictorial representation you've got on your slide, doesn't necessarily address some of the structural barriers that people face. And the structural barriers that people face within healthcare are actually the structural barriers that people face actually within research. And so, for example, I took the NHS plan. There are 19 references to equality and inequality, and only one reference to inequity. And I think for me, we need to be really focusing around some of these structural barriers. This is a really busy slide, and I've used this slide, and it comes from the NIHR Include, which I think is a really good resource for nurse researchers to have. And what you can see in red is lots of different groups and communities that I've worked with that would come under the definition of underserved. And I still see in the nursing literature the terms hard to reach or difficult to access or hidden, which is why I've put it in red. And I think actually what that does is problematize that it's those individuals' fault that they're hard to reach, that they're difficult to access, or they're hidden. And actually I think it's our responsibility as nurses to challenge that perception and to recognize that many of these communities are underserved, and we need to explore why. And whilst I've worked with lots of groups and communities, I don't profess to be a guru in all. Actually, every time I work with different groups, I learn more. And I think it is about that curiosity for us as nurse researchers to recognise there are limits to what it is that we know, and to be open to understanding the world of somebody else, their experiences, so that we can most effectively work with them within research. I think it's interesting if we look at majority of the research methodologies, and there is a domination of Western-centric frameworks in research, and I think we have to accept that and we have to acknowledge that. And so Gabina Eden is a student that I've worked with, actually from Stavanger University in Norway, who's just coming to the end of her PhD. And this is a paper that we co-wrote together as part of her supervisory team. And it is about, actually, we need to embrace other methodologies. And I was really lucky to have been given some funding from Florence Nightingale many years ago at the end of my PhD to spend some time in a Maori research centre. And I think there's lots we can learn from Indigenous methodologies. I think especially around appreciating, understanding, recognising and valuing others' cultures, which may be different from our own cultural beliefs. And I think within that comes that critical reflexivity about one's position. And I've mentioned in here around worldviews, we all have a view of the world, and my view of the world can be very different to somebody else's view of the world. And I think our role as nurse researchers is to suspend our worldview in order to understand and appreciate what it's like for an individual that we are working with, to understand their challenges so we can more effectively develop services to address healthcare inequity. It is about understanding language and language barriers, and yet it's interesting the amount of times we see that people are excluded because English isn't their first language. And I wonder why. And it is more challenging to have interpreters, but actually if we fail to have interpreters, we continue to make those voices hidden. I was really pleased that Roxanne mentioned about religious protocols, because I think it's really important in understanding the faith of other people and the strength that that faith brings, and it's about embracing that within research. It is, for me, fundamentally about co-creating research. It is about working with communities before we even start our research projects to say, what are the research priorities for individuals in those communities? It is about working with them, having them on board as a central part of the research team to develop and guide the research that we're doing. And I'm currently in the process of writing a proposal around offender health of people that are living in prisons. And so working with people who have lived experience of being in prison to say, have I got the language right? Is this language offensive? Because I don't know, I've not had that experience. It is about really having an emphasis on social justice. So I don't believe in doing research for the sake of research. If we're doing research with communities, there should be a benefit to those communities. And it's about working with those communities to say, what should those benefits be and how can we facilitate that? And lastly, it's about looking at different ways of dissemination. We still make an assumption that everybody has really good literacy skills, and we tend to have a plethora of written reports and papers. And actually, we need to do that in much more creative ways, using arts-based approaches, using animation, using illustration, using videos to talk and engage and share some of the findings of our research. So what are the challenges? I think there are challenges in that the preparation and training of our researchers are still from a largely Western-centric approach. And we need to challenge that, and we need to expand that, and we need to embrace different approaches in the education and preparation of our research. I absolutely believe we need to consider our positionality, and we need to address the power dynamics. I think we are very privileged as nurses, that we hold a very privileged place in society, and that often comes with a level of trust from communities, but we need to challenge that, and we need to make sure that we're not abusing it. I really think we need to look at some of the forms that we use. And I think it goes back to where I started around a focus on equity. There's much more standardization with participation information forms, and they're becoming increasingly bigger and bigger as we talk about issues such as GDPR and data holding. And I absolutely believe that we've got to make sure that we have informed consent. But for somebody where literacy may be a challenge, having a 6-page information sheet isn't ethical. And so we've got to work with people that we are researching with in order to develop those participation forms. And again, we need to look at consent. Not everybody can read and write. And so we need to look at alternative methods. And I think part of that is educating ethical approval panels that sometimes I think can be overly cautious and focus on deficits rather than focus on assets within communities. And what that can do is deny citizenship. So it's about how can we present the research, how can we collect the data in a different way that values somebody's strengths rather than focuses on their vulnerability. I have a big challenge and an issue about the reimbursement of participation in research. And I think we have lots of unfunded projects in educational programs. But what's the challenge if you're asking people to give up their time? Is it right that we ask people, especially people that financially can be struggling significantly, especially at the moment with the cost of living crisis, and should there be unfunded projects, or should, if universities are going to have educational programs that include research, should there be funding streams to reimburse participants? And how do we reimburse participants? We make the assumption everybody's got a bank account. If you're living on the street and you're a rough sleeper, you may not have a bank account. So how can we then pay people? And I work at a university, we've got to have clear audit mechanisms, but within that, there's got to be flexibility. We've got to have the process to pay people in advance or use proxy payments, which is around vouchers. But we really need to think about this so we're not disadvantaging people and stopping them from researching. I wanted to look at systematic reviews. I've written systematic reviews and I often review systematic reviews. And it's interesting, I've only recently come across this Progress Plus framework, and some of you may never have heard of it. And it was a colleague actually who shared it with me. It's been around since 2012, and actually using the acronym of Progress and the Plus really gets people to think about diversity within systematic reviews. And yet part of me, when I came across this, is thinking, why is it not part of Prisma itself? Because what we do is we increase the invisibility of certain groups. But if this was part of Prisma, because most people use Prisma, you can't publish a systematic review without using Prisma. This would really highlight the invisibility of particular groups. And so I've put the link there, and I know that they were going to share that with you. So I think actually we need to be looking at these sorts of issues too. So my conclusion really is where do we go now? We are the largest professional group, and I think part of our role as nurses is to advocate for the people that we work with, the individuals and the communities. And for me, it's about researching with, it's not about researching on. It is about ensuring that there is adequate patient and public involvement at every single stage of the research process, and we need to become much stronger around that. I think we have to start challenging, we have to start educating our ethical approval panels. And I wonder, we need to look at the diversity of those panels and look at the training and how we support people to focus on people's strengths rather than just their vulnerabilities. I do think that we have to develop more creative research methodologies. I think they've got to be more inclusive. And I think there is lots that we can learn from things like Indigenous research methodologies, which are growing in strength. I absolutely believe that we need to be critically reflexive and we need to challenge what it is that we think that we know about the world, what we think we know about groups, and how we can continually strive to be better and do better and research better. And part of that is the power dynamics, recognizing our own positionality within the research that we have. I think we need to look at the environment in which we undertake research, and often we'll do focus groups and we invite people maybe into universities. But actually, you know, if you're somebody who's living on the streets and sleeping rough, that can be a really intimidating place. And I think it's about using the money that we get. So I was funded for a project from Burdett to do some work with people to co-produce an app to help people that are sleeping rough to be able to access health and care services. And so I use the money to use my focus groups in the churches, church grounds are a fantastic quiet place, and the churches were fabulous because they're often the ones that are doing the soup kitchens. And so I wanted to spend my money on giving it back to the groups that are helping the communities that I'm researching with. And then also using things like the dissemination funds. So we use some of the money to actually write up the study for the big issue, because actually there's got a huge audience. And so it's about thinking the environment and a more inclusive shared environment. And then lastly, thinking about those more inclusive methods of dissemination. And I think, you know, I truly believe that we shouldn't leave anybody behind, and we shouldn't leave people behind in terms of health and healthcare access, but neither should we leave people behind in terms of research. And we will only stop that when we start calling out the hidden groups that don't have the same opportunities to participate and engage. I'll stop sharing and I'll hand back to Nick. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Absolutely superb set of presentations, and I think so certainly there's a few questions come through. We also had had questions in advance of the webinar. So I'd like to invite all of the speakers to open up their cameras, if you don't mind, and what I'll try to do is I'll try to answer address all of the questions that have come through. We may run out of time, but I'm sure you can follow up for specific answers from the speakers themselves outside the meeting. So I'm going to start off, Vanessa, with just picking up on your final bullet point about dissemination. And so thinking about other methodologies that might be used, non-traditional, should we say non-orthodox, I think that looking at the other end, so if there are aspiring researchers or researchers in the audience, thinking about how we publish our research, and in a way it's even more rigid than the methodologies we use, it's even more formulaic than the methodologies that we use, and yet people's careers, to some extent research careers, rely on that and participating in that piece of theatre. And I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts on how, so we should challenge these things, but how can you challenge that when you're actually at the early stages of a career and you have to toe the line and do the thing like the template, write the paper like a template? So have you got any thoughts about that?
I think it's about us fundamentally thinking, who is the audience that we're writing to? And I think whenever we undertake research, there is an audience that's an academic audience that we're wanting to share and learn from each other and learn from each other's research. But I think there's also the public audience around the communities that we're working with. And I think there are great opportunities around animation, illustration, and coming up with actually you know, a bit like the GIF that Roxanne shared. We can have things that actually are very pictorially based, that can really transcend challenges with language and challenges with literacy. And so for me, I think we have to think about a dual dissemination and build that dual dissemination actually within the work that we're doing. And I think there's also opportunities around engaging with communities to do little films that can be, you know, that can be written up as in a script and can be acted and then shared. You know, lots of hospitals, universities have those lovely video screens, and there are huge opportunities around using those. So I would say it's about planning that dual strategy rather than a singular strategy.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else want to chip in there?
I'll come in. So thanks, Vanessa. Just to pick up on the point about doing a script. So within the Afro-Caribbean community, we usually share lots of information across the fence. So it's usually like a neighborhood scheme. So any ideas for having groups, wherever there's food, wherever there's music, you will find us there. So meeting us at in those social situations and spreading the word, and just using the situation to compare or to bring in a message of health and research is very, very important.
Okay, thank you. Carl, have you got anything to say about that different routes to dissemination, I suppose?
Yes, I agree with the another initiatives in developing tools to promote awareness for these underrepresented communities. I think one of the initiatives in the renal community is developing these leaflets and handouts that's easy to read and more of infographic rather than literatures, because some people may be not that literate enough to read letters. So infographics is the best way of informing the public, especially from the underrepresented group.
Thank you. Mark, there are a couple of questions actually that are more directed about supporting people's research careers. So feel free to chip in with the specifics of the speakers' questions, but there are some questions that I'm kind of reserving more in your direction. Yeah, coming back to actually, Carl, thinking about, I'm thinking more about the kind of research process and recruitment. You had a phenomenal rise in representation with recruitment, and congratulations on that. The 8 initiatives that you showed, that they were to some extent fairly generic initiatives that you might apply to any recruitment. So I'm just wondering about where you're talking about underserved communities or populations. What was it about those initiatives that kind of, what do you think made the biggest difference to the recruitment there? I think you mentioned culturally, I'm not sure the expression that you used, but kind of culturally relevant education and support. But I'm just wondering what made the difference to that enormous rise in representation.
That's right. So using this initiative with the peer educator or peer support, because people tend to be more comfortable if they see someone who look like them, and if they see someone who they can identify with, especially if they had experience already in participating in clinical trials or clinical research or any kind of research. So that really helped, because when we use our patient representative, specifically from Black population and recruiting a Black population, it helps. And also during our recruitment drive, and they see someone who look like them, they actually come to our stand instead of chasing them. So they became so interested. Actually, in one of our recruitment drive in the stand, we didn't have the capacity. There were people who would like to participate, so we didn't have the capacity because there were so many people who would like to sign up. That's why it's becoming a regular occurrence. So having someone to be there who look like them is the key to the success in this recruitment drive. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And so kind of sticking along that theme, so thinking about kind of, I guess, how to overcome barriers to participation. Are there some takeaways, Roxanne, that you might give for the audience? So who might be, people in the audience might be wanting to support diversity in nursing research, and what do you think that they could do individually?
Thank you, Nick. And just that thing that really comes in with another question, I think, is in the chat, looking at, is there any evidence that a researcher who looks like me will increase people's participation? Just did a quick search, and there are lots of papers online looking at people, researchers from the same background will improve research, but it's more about us as a population being more culturally competent, because it's not feasible to drag out every single nurse of an ethnic minority to speak to every single patient. But if we are culturally competent and we understand where our patients are coming from, and we're able to use the resources that we've got, so we've got Language Line, we've got Big Word, you know, if we need to have a chaplain there alongside us so they have a discussion, if we need to give people time to be able to go and speak to their imam, make yourself openly and widely available, employ your techniques that Carl and his team, you know, really researched. But my biggest takeaway was using those faith leaders, because especially in a big period of mistrust, COVID, a new vaccine, a new way of making vaccines, and I mean, as NHS, we were able to see this as well, if we did not engage those faith leaders who were able to bridge the gap between the mistrust of the health community and faith and why we should do it, we would not be where we are today. So my takeaway is to engage people in the local communities, and especially engage their faith leaders, because that has worked in our research.
Okay, thank you. And Vanessa, continuing that theme about overcoming barriers, particularly thinking about audience members who might be able to take something away from this webinar.
I suppose for me, It is, as I said, it's about engaging with people right at the start. So in the development of a bid, it's about finding individuals in those communities, and it's about having an openness to understand those communities. So for example, I'm from a non-Gypsy background, but my PhD was with Gypsy Roma travellers, and there are huge challenges around accessing individuals in those communities because of the challenges, because of the stigma, and because of the discrimination that they face. And so actually what I did was, you know, often people think Gypsy Roma travellers are very patriarchal communities, but in terms of health and healthcare, it's very matriarchal. So actually there are leaders often in community groups that have an advocacy role, or, you know, have a standing within those communities. So it's about taking time to engage with those individuals, and it's about building a rapport, and it is about building the trust that Roxanne talks about, and that doesn't happen overnight, and so that may take multiple meetings. And so it is about building time within your planning of undertaking research to do that groundwork, to really work with individuals, because then actually it's going to be much more successful, your research, because you're going to have people working with you, and people are much more willing, I think, if you work within community networks.
I think, yeah, I mean, that's addressing a couple of the questions that are in the chat about kind of early involvement from the outset.
Nick, can I just jump in for one more thing? I just wanted to highlight something that Carl and his team did about informing the clinicians on the ground to be able to bring patients in. So at Moorfields, we've got an app on our clinical services system such that patients can ask researchers what research is available, and then they just click through to the research department and they can see everything that's available in terms of different eye conditions and refer through that method. And that's helped us to increase our recruitment. We shouldn't underestimate the power of our clinicians in convincing patients that if there isn't a standard treatment available, research is always an option, because at the end of the day, research is everyone's business. So we should get as many people as aware of what research we do in our institutions as possible.
Thank you. Mark, you're unmuted.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, there's actually a couple of really good questions actually in the chat box, both anonymous attendees actually. One talks about the issue around inclusivity and the focus around researching with and not researching on as part of Professor Hislop's talk. And I think it's a really good question here about where do we draw the line in engaging with a group researching and don't influence the objectivity and introducing bias into the research process. So I think that's actually hit something. And actually what's really interesting underneath that is a great question, which do you have any evidence that if a researcher is part of a Black and minority community, recruitment of Black and minority participants in research studies would increase? Now, I think these two questions actually lend themselves really well to, I think, some theoretical positions that we must understand as researchers in particular. So one is this issue around objectivity, and also potentially what I would describe as the emancipatory nature of some research. So there's often a debate about, as an example, you know, as a man, can I do feminist research? Actually, I think it's a really important question there, actually, that you can do work that has a feminist perspective, but do you have truly lived experience to be able to understand that? What are your biases and therefore your influences in the interpretation that you bring to that? Now, of course, that's from a gender perspective, but of course we can apply that to lots of the nature of intersectionality in relation to that research. So I think there is a fundamental driver here about what is the nature of the research, what is its aim, and therefore what is the approach that might be taken in, from a methodological point of view that could be mediated by some regards by having a really open idea about two things. Firstly is absolutely that question, researching with and having those public and participants involved in the design and the development of that, because that will absolutely drive some of those improvements. But also that important question around your own individual bias as a researcher, and how do you mitigate that within both the research design and methodology, and also the voice and representation of those that you're studying and supporting in terms of doing that. So I think there's kind of three elements to this: the kind of potential emancipatory nature of what you're doing and the focus of that, the kind of approach and methodologies you have in terms of the design, and that's as important as the information you're collecting as a researcher, versus how do we do that to ensure that representation of the voice is accurately described within the research itself? So I love those two questions, actually, because I think they reach back into some really, really interesting topics for us as researchers to understand. But I'd be kind of interested in colleagues on the panel, what their thoughts may be on that.
Nick, can I come in here?
Sure,
Because
yeah.
I think it's really interesting. So, you know, I think it brings in those debates about insider and outsider. And actually, it's not a continuum. You're never fully an insider and you're never fully an outsider. So if I think back to the research that I've done with Gypsy Roma Travellers, I'm not a Gypsy Roma Traveller, although my husband is from that community, but there were shared insider moments because I was also speaking to women and I was also speaking to mothers. And so it is actually very complex. And I think that's where really understanding and being honest and open about your position in the research is fundamental. I think you can actually do research with participants of a community that you are working with, and I have done that. But part of that is making sure that actually that the co-researchers that you employ as part of the research project actually are given a grounding in research, where you have discussions around these very issues around bias and challenge. You know, nobody should be doing research without any research training, whether you're a nurse, whether you're a member from a community, or you're a student. And so it is about adequately preparing and supporting somebody, but equally there should be quality assurance checks in research, whether it's as participants as co-researchers or researchers who are outside that community. You build that quality assurance. You know, if it's a qualitative piece of research, you'll have somebody else that will look at the analysis, and we build that in irrespective, I would argue, whether it's community members or not. That's good research.
Okay, anyone else care to comment on that? We can easily move on. There's plenty of questions to go at. We may not have time to cover some of the specific points that people are asking for elaboration on. Work in prisons, there might be a topic that we cover at a subsequent webinar. So there will be opportunity to make suggestions for future webinars. So if there are some things that we don't cover here, anything might be a suitable topic, then please let us know what they are. I just want to get a bit kind of practical, I suppose. So there was a question came through about prior to the webinar, actually part of the sign-up process, thinking about people who might want to do research around, for example, to support research around inequity in healthcare, and what avenues might they kind of explore to get that kind of support that they could carry out that specifically research in that area. So that's, I think, Mark, maybe you could kick off with that, and then we'll talk about the experience of people, the real lived experience of people who maybe have explored avenues and secured funding, etc.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I mean, it's a really important question, and one that's intrinsically a real challenge, particularly within nursing, midwifery and allied health research compared to more established professions and established research programs. One of the reasons we developed the national nursing strategy in relation to with the CNO was primarily to drive real change, actually, in a number of areas that we wanted to see in particular. So one of the key issues, obviously, is around making sure that all of the infrastructure arrangements that other professions actually have are available to support them, particularly in terms of how do we develop increased investment to support nurses to lead their own research, participate in it, and deliver research for social benefit. And one of the things that's within that, of course, is access to career opportunities and funding. So we've been working with the NIHR and a range of other organisations to improve the funding situation, something we've also been doing with both life sciences at government level and also the Department of Health and Social Care as part of the overall CNO delivery plan. So what we're aiming to do with the investment strategies that come is increase the number of early career opportunities for people, particularly around some of the benefits we see through MRES programs, which are extremely popular and provide the gateway into that. But of course, making sure that there's enough funded PhD opportunities for individuals, and also onwards then the postdoc environment for people to further advance their careers. Now, part of that is also linking the NHS to universities to be really structured about the intrinsic link between academic careers and also NHS careers, because we haven't done that well. And I think the evidence points to the fact that actually it's very, very difficult to navigate a complex clinical academic career for a nurse or midwife. So making simple changes around things like contract arrangements, funding arrangements, joint posts, etc., are really important. But actually the infrastructure around the opportunity is there and really important to achieve. So people have access to the courses, the funding opportunities, the career progression opportunities, but also quite critically, the support they're going to get from both institutions, both at NHS level and also at the university. So the research plan really goes into this in quite some detail, because we realise that this is one of the critical issues that we need to solve for individuals who really want to pursue a career as either as a clinical academic or as an academic, moving from NHS into the academic world, notably those working in nursing, midwifery and allied health professions.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And I wonder if we could go around each of the panelists, talk about your own experiences. Carl, maybe kicking off with you, also maybe to address one of the questions just popped in, thinking about how to get not just secure the support, financial support, etc., for the research, but also to secure buy-in from, for example, in this case, it was the nursing directorate, but thinking about buy-in from nursing to this as a research area.
Yes, research is really increasing in popularity in the last decades for nurses as research as a career option, and I think there's a lot to be done to support nurses to venture in research, and clinical and research integration should be part of the job plan for research for nurses in the clinical area, because sometimes, because it is not usually tackled amongst themselves, that they forget that there is research happening in the department. And one of the reasons as well why research clinical nurses are not aware of research is because the lack of visibility of research nurses in the wards, for example, because they're more visible in the outpatient department. So our colleagues in outpatient department are more research aware than in the wards. So perhaps integration of clinical research would bridge this gap. And also, for example, if there is, for example, clinical nurses doing their, for example, renal course, they could spend more time together with the renal research nurses so that they could experience how research is being done. So integration between research and clinical, I think, would be the key to have a buy-in for this.
Thank you. And Vanessa, I wonder if, so framing this as I'm a nurse in practice, really interested in research, desperately interested in getting my hands on research around inequity in healthcare. But my directorate is just not interested, and it's falling on deaf ears. How can we actually progress that? So in terms of practical approaches of thinking about how you approach research, the support that you got, both or the support you secured, I should say, not necessarily bestowed on you, but you secured, and maybe talk to that so that people do have something that they can practically apply.
Yeah, and I would say my advice is to link to your local university. Local universities will have research centres. I can't always say that those research centres are going to be focused exclusively on inclusion health. Does that make sense? There may be a research centre that's focused on diabetes. I was just thinking of the work, that Carl mentioned earlier. But actually within that, there will be people who will be interested in the communities and groups who experience diabetes. And so I would say, those research centres can have research fellows. You can have visiting fellowships with universities, and it's about building those relationships. And I think we have a responsibility. I think I have a responsibility as a professor of nursing to actually reach out to clinical colleagues and say, actually, my role, I think, is to support research and to work collaboratively together. And how can we build those networks and build those links? I do think there needs to be nationally more focus on having some joint nurse professor roles, I have to say, between clinical trusts and universities to really champion that building capacity and capability. So I think there should be a nurse researcher, and I mean somebody who's leading research, not not always doing some of the data collection, which I think is predominantly what our role has been in the past. It is about enabling to have nurses to do PhD so they can become principal investigators. They can lead and drive research in clinical trusts and then build that community, that critical mass where you can have other people to support and talk to you about nursing research. So I think part of it individuals can do on a local level. I think part of it we have to look at a strategic level.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And Roxanne.
Thanks, Nick. My strategy has always been to link the issue that I'm facing to the trust strategic priorities. So, I mean, they've got a list of priorities that they want to have done for I'm going to get shot here, for political reasons or for health reasons. However, if you can link the issues that you see to the trust priority, then you're going to get your project through. You're going to get people buying in because then it's linked, and therefore it's going to bring kudos. It might bring in money. It might bring in more patients, more services. However, you can link your current program to their ideas or to speak their language, then you'll be able to get your work done. Obviously, you also go and you speak to the research departments. Some do have it and some don't, but you'll be able to speak to your research portfolio managers, and they should be able to link you up with further links to statisticians, grant writers, if you have them in your hospital, to be able to go through your idea and talk you through the whole PICO, population intervention comparator outcome, and help you to shape and frame your question. But these people are there. Sometimes they're very quite hidden, but they are there in each foundation trust or in each department. And you should be able to access these people to develop your idea. Again, I'm sure Vanessa, her details are there, my details are there, Carl's details are there. If you need to speak to us offline, and we'll be happy to give any advice. Sorry, guys.
No, I think that's right. I'll bring you in a sec, Mark. No, I think that's right. I think the mapping to the priorities are really important. And if the priorities don't match this area that we've been talking about, then shame on the organisation, actually, and the priorities need to change. But doing that mapping is always really important. And sometimes we forget that the kind of vision and strategy level is really important to pin onto that, because once you're hooked onto that, you get pulled along to some extent. Thank you. Sorry, Mark.
No, I mean, colleagues have made some really, really important points there, actually. And one of the issues is also around playing to your strengths, which is actually, I think, really critical in this idea of actually looking at the organizational strategy. But I'd also suggest looking at the research opportunities that exist at the individual university. When I was chief nurse at University Hospitals Coventry and Warwickshire, we actually worked with 4 universities because it was quite evident, actually, that each university had massive strengths in 2 or 3 areas. And actually working with a diverse portfolio of research opportunities maximise their impact, particularly around things like REF as an example, plus the skills and the aspirations that we had within the organisation. But one of the really mission critical things is actually our core workforce having a real appreciation of the evidence base that is generated from research. Now, we inculcate that within the undergraduate and the postgraduate curriculums. We do that so well. But of course, once people step out into clinical practice, I think it's Carl's point, they just don't get exposed to it. So we have to wait for those really interested people to kind of fight their way through into a research career if they get inspired by somebody. But actually, we lose sight of sometimes, actually, the use of evidence base in daily clinical practice. And I think there is something for us in professional practice to start to think about, how do we get people to see what they do, the decisions they make, even on a daily basis within a clinical environment, are evidence-based by researchers, and connect researchers to those things. I think there's lots we can do around that. I think that would be really helpful. Some of it is structural, some definitely is at national policy level. But I think there's an important conversation to be had within the profession, actually, about why we're sending inspired young people out of our universities, but they never then use some of the skills skills that we've given them to do work in research. I think that's something for the universities to think about, and I think that's something for the NHS Trust to really get a grip of.
Right, thank you. We're coming towards the end of the time allocated. There's lots of questions still there. I hope we've answered most of them, and I'm sorry that we're running out of time for some of them. But I'm sure, as I said, no academic I've ever met, or nobody that works in research, has minded someone saying, "Oh, I really admire your work. Can I have a chat about it?" So don't worry about that. Just do a little bit of ego bathing, and you can have a good old chat about anything. So if there are any particular questions, then please contact people directly. But I just wanted to do a final round of. So I'd like you all each to think of something that people are going to write down. It's so important, and they're going to take it away, and they're going to remember it and say it to other people. So just kind of a golden nugget, if you like, to take away from what you've been talking about today about this particular area. So I think I'll start with Roxanne.
Thanks, Nick. I was just trying to think through that. Advocacy. Your role as a nurse, you started off as an patient advocate, and therefore, if you come into research, you're the patient's advocate. Let's never lose sight of that.
Thank you. Very useful. Vanessa?
I agree with that one, and I'm going to add a bit of curiosity to the mix, because I think it's about being curious. It's about always wanting to know more, to understand more in order to make it better.
Thank you. Advocacy, curiosity. Carl?
Be visible. So we have to be visible, and we have to, in relation to the curiosity, so we have to know what we want and pursue what we want.
Okay, thank you. And Mark, so we're now down to one word, a thematic word. We've got advocacy, visibility, curiosity, and
Belief.
Belief
in ourselves as a profession. You know, we're a scientific evidence-based profession, so believe in the skills and knowledge that we've got to go out there and address some of these really important research questions.
Thank you. So would you like to say just a few words on behalf of NHS England, just to kind of round things off from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And thank you for everybody who's joined the event today. These series have been really excellent. We've had some really good speakers throughout the series, and today we focused on a really important area. And I think with over 500 people wanting to join this, it really does demonstrate the kind of appetite out there for both understanding these questions and importantly explore them, but also importantly to really start to think about how we might address those through nursing research. Like I say, the CNO strategy has been, the final plan has been published. We're going to be doing a lot more across the both national and regional, as well as also into institutional level. So there will be a huge number of opportunities over the coming 5 years to really start to think about how we leverage all of that expertise for further development of nursing researchers. So there'll be lots of opportunities to get involved in that. So if it does come your way and you're interested, then please get in touch with your local or national teams, because they'll be really, really keen to hear from people who want to really move forward with this agenda.
Thank you very much. And thank you to our speakers, to Carl, Roxanne and Vanessa, for wonderful presentations, really wonderful, and sharing your insights. Thanks also to Mark for joining us today and sharing your insights. So for the audience members, there'll be a link posted in the chat that will help us in terms of planning future events. Your views are really important. The reason that we have the theme for today's webinar is because of previous audience members have recommended it as a topic. So please do spend a few minutes filling it out with honest feedback. We want it to be as good as useful as possible. Use the survey to make other suggestions for other topics as well, as I mentioned. So I hope you found it interesting and informative. I hope you leave the event with a sense of pride in our wonderful profession and a curiosity to get more engaged and involved in research in nursing. On behalf of the School of Human and Health Sciences at the University of Huddersfield and NHS England, I'd like to thank you for coming along, and I hope to see you again next time. Take care. Thank you. Good afternoon.